Has your inner voice been quashed or silenced? Do you feel small or unseen due to the forces of your upbringing, relationships, or society itself? Do you wish you could take up space, speak your truth, and show up as your authentic self without fear or constantly apologizing? I've found that many people have lost the courage or never developed the ability to use their authentic voice because they learned, often early on in life, that they had to be quiet, good, or obedient in order to be loved or found worthy. But I'm here to help you discover that the opposite is true. Genuine love for the self and with others comes from the freedom of knowing and expressing your inner truth. By discovering and embracing the power of your own authentic, vibrant voice, you can set yourself free to live fearlessly, if imperfectly. Today, we'll focus on this listener's real life question. I'm always anxious, especially with my husband. He's a good guy, but really critical, just like my mom and dad were. I'm always worried that our relationship will fall apart if I say or do the wrong thing. It's the same at work and with friendships. Is there a cure for this? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Manly, and this is Imperfect Love. Please note, as this episode may contain sensitive information, listener discretion is advised. If you need support, please see the special links in the show notes.
Welcome to Imperfect Love with Dr. Carla Marie Manly, psychologist, author, and relationship expert. I'm here to help unravel mysteries and misconceptions about love, relationships, and mental health issues, plus everything in between. Love is complicated, people are not perfect, and relationships surely can be tough. Together, we'll navigate this messy, imperfect space of real life.
Today, I am joined by a very wonderful guest, Soha Al-Jurf, who will be sharing her expertise on discovering or reclaiming your own voice. Soha is the author of the book, Even My Voice is Silence. Soha is a speech pathologist, a voice trainer, and she has a double master's and such extraordinary experience in the realm of helping others find, express, and live in the truth of their inner voices. Welcome to the podcast, Soha. It is such a joy to have you with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we launch into the topic of today, could you share with our listeners just a little bit about what makes you you? I know you have such vast expertise and so much training in many realms that you bring into the world today. It's like this amalgamation of all of this beautiful training and life experience to help people live and be their best selves. Please, before we get into the particulars of how to do this, could you tell us a little bit about what makes you you?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. I would say what makes me is like you said, an amalgamation of things. I'm a child of immigrants. My parents are Palestinian, which I know is a contentious thing to even say out loud at this moment in time, but it is who I am, and I'm proud of it. And so that lineage definitely impacts my sense of voice, my sense of being silenced, my sense of oppression or people who are oppressed. And that is actually what my first book is about, Even My Voice is Silence. It's about my journey back to Palestine. But I was raised in the States, and because of my father's history, he used to listen to a lot of opera. So he worked in Libya after he graduated from medical school in Cairo, and Libya is most people probably know, some may not, was occupied by the Italians. And so there was a lot of opera everywhere when he was working his first job in Libya. So I grew up with, definitely multicultural music, lots of Arabic music, lots of Western music, but I also had this opera in the background all the time. And so that was what was in my ear, and it was what I wanted to do. It's what I wanted to sing. So I sang all the way through, I kind of from grade school, they noticed that I had a singing voice that should be heard, and so that was what I did throughout high school. I had sort of the leads in the musicals, and I was in the choir and that kind of thing, and took that into college. And somewhere in there, my voice developed a crack. And I could no longer pursue my professional career. We couldn't resolve it with technique. Medically, we couldn't find anything wrong. Now that I have gotten the speech pathology degree and I know voice science, I suspect there's probably a little bit of scar tissue on the vocal folds, maybe from screaming when I was a teenager or, playing sports, that kind of thing. But it was unresolvable. And so by the time I finished my undergrad and I was about to head into graduate school, I reached a real kind of life crossroads. I couldn't continue with my singing career. That is what I thought I was going to do. And I went to see a speech pathologist and an ear, nose, throat doctor to see if they could identify what was going on to diagnose the problem. And they really couldn't find anything. So it was out of that frustration and limitation that I went to pursue the speech pathology degree and went and pursued a degree. I'm from Iowa. I grew up in Iowa, and the University of Iowa just happens to have one of the best voice programs really in the world. But that was sheer luck. And so, when I look back on it now, I feel that it was a very spiritually guided path. At the time, it felt like obstacles and limits and things that I did not want. But ultimately, I feel now that they were leading me to my destiny. So I did the master's degree. Worked clinically as a speech pathologist, specialized in voice for about 20, 25 years in various ear, nose, and throat clinics on a team, evaluating and treating people who have voice disorders. And then because of my opera background, I always specialized in opera. And at some point in that, I just really realized that the the medical aspects were wonderful. I loved my work. And the spiritual aspects and the psychological aspects were calling me even more than just the sort of physical therapy for the voice. So I loved my work. I loved what I did. I loved my patients. And there always seemed to be this psycho-spiritual component that was just really gnawing at me to go deeper. So that's when I got the second master's degree in Jungian and archetypal psychology. And that's what I do now. I combine voice, psychology, spirituality, and sort of feminine consciousness into this new modality of work that I'm doing.
What an extraordinary background. And I really appreciate all of the parts of it. And in hearing you, start off saying Palestine, and maybe that's not the most, you might not get the warmest welcome in certain spheres. It's so important for us to remember that our lineage, it's part of us. I'm half Russian, and I'm certainly not going, we don't want to have to be in a position of apologizing for acts that may or may not be occurring in a country where our roots originated. And so I really welcome you here as a guest. I find your history quite entrancing and taking you step by step to where you are meant to be. Each issue has taken you to this place where now you are helping people literally find their voices, the speaking voice, but also, which is the focus of today's episode, helping people find that inner voice, the internal voice that has been quashed or perhaps never discovered. And um, I know this from personal history where it is so hard when one has been quashed from childhood forward. So hard to find that voice and then learn to listen to it and then express it in an authentic, genuine, gracious way. It's not an easy process. So I'm so appreciative to have you here today to help guide our guests, our listeners, to see where they might be able to amplify their voice, discover their voice, live in accord with that voice. So before we start that piece, could you explain to our listeners a little bit by what you mean when you're talking about the feminine? So many times we think that the feminine means we need to be the good girl, the stay-at-home mom, and be a doormat. Whereas the feminine, as you and I happen to have similar training, so we know that the feminine can be quite powerful, quite strong, quite resilient, quite forceful, and quite fierce when she needs to be. So please explain that. And then for our male listeners who are tuning in, to maybe explain to them that there is also room here in the feminine voice for people of all genders.
Yeah. So you and I think, both share at least a sort of background in Jungian psychology. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to Jung is that he really has he has sort of a desire, first of all, to get at kind of the truth of the psyche, sort of what's really happening at the core of our psychological being, but not just as individuals, as a collective. And so Jung basically, one of his focuses in his work is on the archetypes, on this idea that there are essences of beingness that are cross-cultural and cross-historical, and that we almost inherit as a blueprint in our DNA. And one of those things that Jung thought was that we all contain the masculine and the feminine. And these are just energies. From a Jungian perspective, a lot of these archetypes come out in myth, in fairy tales. And so, like you're saying, if you go into myths from all sorts of different cultures, you'll find gods and goddesses who are who have all sorts of characteristics. They're archetypal, they're not actual people, but you'll find, if you look into even just Greek myth, you'll find female energies that are represented by the symbols of the goddesses, who are caretakers of the fire, who are caretakers of the home and the hearth, who are warriors, who are wives, who are mothers. And so all of those archetypes are represented in the pantheon, let's say, of the gods and goddesses. Jung thought, and I don't call myself a Jungian because I also like to problematize Jung, because he still came out of a history and a lineage that was very patriarchal. And I'm not going to say it was masculine, I'm going to say it was patriarchal. And again, archetypally, the patriarch is the all-knowing, authoritative voice. It's the, my way or the highway, I am king of this land voice. And that is one archetype of the masculine. So it gets tricky when we talk about it in terms of masculine and feminine. I keep waiting for a better way to describe these energies. However, the basic essence of the masculine and feminine can be thought to go back to sort of womb consciousness versus more phallic consciousness. And again, we just start getting into trouble immediately when we start talking about these things. But if you think, generally speaking, about the patriarch as an archetype, and then you sort of connect that with masculine anatomy, just to be simple, or the masculine body, the male body in terms of its sex, the male representation archetypally is going to be hard, it's going to be penetrating, it's going to be directed, it's going to be, like I said, authoritative. And that is the societal structure in which we live. The what we're calling feminine, which would have more of a womb consciousness to it, so it's more internal, it's darker. In Chinese medicine, it would be considered yin. It would be more moist, more damp, more cocooning, not necessarily nurturing, because there can definitely be a nurturing in the sense of usually protective energy with the masculine. But feminine consciousness is all of that, which is kind of that, again, it's an archetypal mother. It's an archetypal maternal. We all know that there are mothers who are real life mothers who are lovely and warm and huggy, and there are real life mothers who are rigid and strict and didn't really want to be mothers. So we have to think of it archetypally, which is sort of the energy or the essence. And from my perspective, we live in a patriarchal culture which favors that archetype of the patriarch, the one that is on Wall Street or is corporate, has success, the one that's in a business suit, the one again that's hard, directed, rigid, um, and forward thinking. The feminine spirit or consciousness is much more cyclical, just like the menstrual cycle, just like the moon cycles. Feminine consciousness is theoretically softer. It's moonlight rather than sunlight. And again, you can find this in Chinese medicine as well as in Jungian psychology. But that's what I'm talking about in terms of feminine consciousness. And for most of us, whether you look at it literally as women, and statistics of women being, assaulted, oppressed in whatever ways, their voice has been silenced to a large degree by masculine consciousness. Now, obviously, I'm sitting here talking, but what that means is that for most of us women who want to enter public spaces, there's an assumption that we have to enter with a masculine energy coming through us, one that's directive, one that's forceful, one that's authoritative. Otherwise, nobody's going to listen to us. So that's sort of the distinction between the masculine and feminine voice in particular that I'm drawing.
Thank you for that clear explanation. And listeners, that's a lot. So I'm going to slow it down and highlight a few pieces of what Soha really offered in such a beautiful, deep way that when you may have heard this before on one of my podcasts, the archetypes, it sounds complex and it sounds sometimes a bit scary to people. But if we think about it, if you've ever seen tarot cards, you see the images on those cards, the king, the queen, the orphan, the fool. Those are all archetypes. What they mean is that no matter what culture you go to around the world, no matter what language you're speaking, people will know what it means to be a widow, what it means to be a wife, what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a queen. And so when Soho was talking about the collective consciousness, it's the fact that if you think about all of those images swirling in the ether around the world, you could show a card that you drew of someone crying to someone in any culture, and they would understand the crying person. That's an archetype. So as we're moving into finding our voices, understanding some of these basics will help you understand the journey forward. And I can take a minute and make this personal so that you understand from me what I was saying at the beginning. If we are taught as a child that a good girl must essentially have tape over her mouth or a big smile on her face, or children and are seen and not heard, we could make that into an archetype. We could make a card with a feminine, a girl with her tape on her mouth, her hands in handcuffs, and the word yes somehow coming out of her mouth. That would be an archetype. And what, please correct me on this if I've, have it wrong, but that archetype, we could also put a person of any gender in that card. It could be a male, and they could have tape across their mouth and handcuffs because they were taught that their voice had to be silenced, that in order to be loved or seen as worthy, they had to be quiet. And so when we move into this, we're calling it the archetype of the good child, the silent child, the obedient child. That will resonate likely with anyone listening who has ever felt oppressed by this strong force. We can call it the patriarchy for ease, that voice that is very authoritarian coming down on us, telling us that we should be a certain way. And what that does to the internal psyche, to the self, to the being, is it makes you walk around like you're walking on eggshells, like you can't really ever be comfortable in your own skin because you don't know who you are. Or you kind of know who you are, and that you might want to scream and shout and tumble on the grass and run around and speak your truth. But you were taught not to. You were taught to walk the straight and narrow. How did I do with that?
That was great. And I would say that, to me, just to expand on what you're describing, the voice is to me feminine. Whether it comes out of a male body or a female body, the voice itself is feminine. And to understand that, to understand kind of where I'm coming from, it helps to have a little bit of an understanding of where the origins of psychology came from in terms of the history of Freud coming through the classics and all the way back to the Greeks, and this idea that logos or speech was the realm of the masculine. It came in the realm of the masculine. And there's a woman named Julia Kristeva. She's a French Bulgarian post-Freudian feminist psychoanalyst. And she writes a lot about this idea of having abjected the feminine or abjected the mother. And so, what really got me thinking about all of this was this idea that talk therapy itself, the idea of talking, the idea of logos, the idea of speech, if we go back historically, is put in the masculine. And so Kristeva started saying, okay, well, if you go into looking into sort of psychoanalysis and many, many spin-offs of philosophy that came out of psychoanalysis, there's this idea that logos is masculine. And the question then for Kristeva was, where is the mother in psychoanalysis? And to a degree, Jung thought much more about the maternal as well, this idea of having this maternal matrix that we all come out of, which in Jungian psychology is often equated a little more to the unconscious, the dream world, images, mythos, poetry. It's all those things that kind of subvert straight up speech. And when we go to therapy, all we really can do with our therapist is talk and words. And what the therapist ultimately is trying to get to is, okay, you're telling me your script, you're telling me your story, but if this story were really why you were suffering, we would have resolved it from your story. So a good therapist is trying to follow that thread of the story back to figure out, okay, what's at the core of that? Well, that core to Kristeva and to me is the voice. And so that voice is that, again, I'm borrowing from Kristeva's work, but this was something where, from my own work in opera and my own work in voice, my own work with people who've lost their voices, and have come to me clinically, or opera singers who've come with vocal damage and have not been able to sing. My question throughout my entire career has always been, why is it so emotionally damaging to have a voice disrupted or distorted, to feel like you cannot sing when you once could, or that somebody has lost their voice? It has such a huge impact on quality of life to lose one's voice. And so I started kind of digging into that, like, what is that? Because my words are still coming out. I never had a patient who couldn't speak words, but the core essence of the voice was lost. And with opera singers, that seemed to be heightened, right? Because they're sort of at the height of using their voice in a very Olympic sort of way. And it was very self-defining. It was very, there was a lot of work that went into it. But even a layperson who had, a hoarseness from some sort of injury to the vocal cord tissue, they also had a huge impact on the quality of their lives when they lost their voice, not their speech, their voice. So they could still speak, but somehow the core essence that represented them wasn't coming out when they spoke. They were no longer themselves. They could no longer identify as themselves when their voices and speech came out of their mouths. That got me really curious, and especially when I'd have, every opera singer I was working with would come into my office crying. Like, why was it so heavy? And throughout my own research, and again, kind of guided by the work of Kristeva, and then combining that with Jung, I started to think that there was something about the archetypal voice of the feminine that was silenced, throughout history with the advent of patriarchy, and that all of us, men and women, we all carry that silenced voice of the mother. And when it becomes further silenced, I think it is on a soul level painful to us.
That makes perfect sense because you're using the voice itself. Like if Dr. Carla lost her ability to speak in the voice I use now, and all of a sudden it became raspy and unfamiliar to me, which is what we experience when we have a really bad cold. It doesn't sound like us. We're not comfortable with us. And you're saying that that's coming from, if an ailment that will go away in a week or whatever. But for someone, especially if you're using your voice as a singer, that would create almost a disconnection from the self. And so if we take this to a level of all humanity, our inner voice, that voice, when that too is silenced, then we are split off from the psyche, that psyche that drives us forward to evolve imperfectly toward our best selves. And what you were calling, I do have a question. When we're talking about the patriarchy, so we know most people are familiar with that's that voice, that authoritarian kind of power, archetypally male energy that is, as you said, my way or the highway, right, wrong, good, bad. Whereas when we look at it as what you're calling the mother voice, that is the flip side of that. That would be the maternal voice that at its best is encouraging, nurturing, generous, authentic, supportive, all of those lovely things. And it's not that one is good and one is bad, but when they are married, when they are used, it's interesting. In these words aren't going to necessarily resonate with you because you've already ruled one out. But in my first book, Joy from Fear, I was counseled to not use the word masculine and feminine because they're not taken in the way that young meant them now. So I really researched it and worked with someone who's very good at linguistics, and she gave me some suggestions, and I finally really decided to adopt power energy to replace the masculine and nurture energy to replace the feminine. Not that all feminine is nurturing and not that all masculine is power, but we got away from the masculine and the feminine. And so if we see that, at least in symbolism, that the patriarchy can be power, the mother energy, we can see her as nurturing the self, perhaps, supporting the self, supporting that voice that has been silenced by, as you say, the voice of logos, rationalism. And this is something that affects so many of my clients, both people of all genders, but particularly women, where they will say, I'm being told that I'm irrational. I'm being told that I'm not thinking clearly, that I am too much in my body, or I should not listen to my instincts, that I should be rational and clear-headed and clear-minded. All of this, yes, we do want to be clear-minded, but we also do want to be listening to instinct, to the maternal voice. Because that's the complement. We want both of them married in beautiful balance, the yin and the yang. And when we take out one part of it and make the other side very, very heavy, which we've done, we've made the masculine side or that power side or the patriarchy side, call it what you will, so heavy. Look at what's happened to society. There is so much suffering. And it's one of my beliefs, I'd like your opinion on this, that so many people who are suffering from anxiety, depression, hopelessness, all of these things are suffering from a loss of their voice.
100%. And I think that, I think it becomes tricky depending on a person's worldview, but men are suffering under patriarchy too.
Oh, yes,
The only
yes.
And there are women who succeed under patriarchy. If you are naturally inclined toward, and I think power is tricky too, because women are certainly very powerful. And if we go to what you were describing before in terms of the archetypes, if you look at gods and goddesses, especially in the like Indian pantheon, in the Hindu pantheon, you'll find all sorts of, females wielding swords, and, it's not a delicate mother image. And those of us who've ever been in the protection of children, who've had needed to protect children, we also know that that is not all nurturing. I mean, if I'm out in public, I don't have children of my own, but if I'm out in public with a baby or my nieces and nephews or a child and something threatens them, that's, and you can call that masculine, you can call it whatever you want, but I'm gonna get aggressive. You can call it mama bear archetype, you can call it whatever you want, but there is a protective instinct in me as well. And I don't know if that's a motherly protective instinct that's distinct somehow from a fatherly. I don't know. It can get very complicated. But I think that we need to acknowledge and recognize that if you are in a female body and you live naturally in alignment with what I'm calling a patriarchal construct, you will do well. And the opposite is true. If you are a man and you really just want to be a poet, or a painter or something that is considered, that isn't, I'm just going to say, like corporate Wall Street suit, making money, capitalized, then you're also going to suffer. And what I was finding, what I sort of started looking at, especially because my specialization was in opera singers, one of the things that I was always very curious about when you're looking at opera singers, now again, I'm working archetypally, and I'm saying that a woman singing opera is the quintessential archetype of the divine feminine voice. That's the hypothesis I'm working under. And when that voice is damaged, she feels somehow that she has failed the matriarch, or she has had taken away from her the power of her archetypal lineage all the way back to what I would call the goddess, to what I would call, sort of divine feminine strength. That empowerment she's been cut off from. Now, in my experience, if we go back to sort of voice science, what causes injury on the vocal folds? Well, put simply, it's too much singing, too high, meaning too high of a frequency, because higher frequency has more vibrations per second. So that's what sopranos do as opposed to lower voices. Too much, too high, too loud. Too much pressure on the vocal folds creates injury, impact injury on the vocal folds. Then you have swelling on the vocal folds and they no longer vibrate normally. What is the most likely thing to cause that excessive pressure? A desire to compete, a desire to prove oneself, and a feeling of a need to be louder than one's body really is capable of. So again, if we sort of take this back to psychology, it's the denial of the body, it's the denial of the feminine, it's the denial of the weaker sex, however you want to look at it. I have to push through my voice in order to either be taken seriously, to be heard, or to be loud enough to be heard over an orchestra, to sing on a stage. And so what I started to get curious about was, is there a common archetype between the men and the women who end up with vocal injuries? Now, it's primarily women just because physiologically, women's vocal cords are more prone to injury. That's a physiologic fact based on how the anatomy is. But that doesn't mean I don't work with men. And when I am working with men, they are either people who are typically, I have to push the heck out of this patriarchal archetype to compete with everyone, then they get injured. Or, especially the men who work with me, they are sensitive, sweet, like they were the little boys who were shy and just kind of found out they could sing. And then suddenly they're in these roles where they're expected to fit into that archetype, but that's not where their heart and soul is. And so when I'm going to help somebody rehabilitate a voice, what I'm going back to is, where is your actual alignment? Where is your actual soul? Where's your actual heart? And how do we get that in alignment literally with the resonance of your own body? So that rather than pushing the heck out of the air that's going through your vocal cords to try to prove yourself, we're actually asking, what does it actually feel like to be embodied in my body? And then what does my voice feel like when it's connected to my body and my breath and coming through me? That's mine. Now, For every body, there will be a physiologic limit. They're just like an athlete. An athlete can only go run as fast as they can run. Can they improve? Yes. And if they get injured, can they rehabilitate? Yes. But my core essential question in life is, if you relax into your own body, really tune in with who you are, know thyself, open your mouth, take a breath, and then sing or speak. What's coming out? Who's coming out? What is that voice? And then how can we hone that to be yours and also acceptable by the public if being in public is what you want to do, if being on stage is what you want to do? Inevitably, if we're singing or speaking in alignment with the instrument, it's always more efficient and effective than trying to sing or speak with somebody else's voice or with somebody else's idea of what a voice should be.
Wow, wow, wow. That was amazing. You had me transfixed. Why? Because what you're talking about on a practical level, I can see as being a metaphor, of course, for our listeners who don't sing for a living, who aren't opera singers, which is most of us,
Yes.
me included, and saying, so if I take a deep breath in, deep breath out, and align myself and make it a practice to align myself, to take the time to dive in and say, what do I today, this moment, what do I want to say?
Exactly.
If anything,
Exactly.
what does that sound like?
That's right.
How can I be mindful and intentional with this voice so that whatever is coming through me is aligned with what my soul is asking? And often we're coming, which I think is where we tend to get blocked. If we're coming from this male brain, this word brain that's saying you should be this way, you should act this way, you should say this, you should stay silent, you should speak, you should. Let's wipe that slate clean, tabula rasa, and go back and say, listeners, by the way, this is for you. If we all just pause and simply ask ourselves, after I take a deep breath in and deep breath out, in this moment, what does that authentic voice, if I make space for it, what is it asking me to say? How
Exactly.
is it asking me to show up in a way that is aligned with my true self? Is that singing out loud? Is that being assertive? Is that being quiet? Is that being silent? Is that being invigorated? Is it being wild? What, and that, so we can see that as we're practicing this simple exercise that you've offered us, which is alignment, making space, maybe morning, noon, night, and 1,000 times in between, to really get seated, not in what the brain is telling us to do, whether it's the fear center, fight, flight, whatever it is, or the dictates that we grew up with, from childhood forward, but discovering. And listeners, this is no small ask. If you had asked me to do this exercise, you know, 20 years ago, I would have looked at you and said, what are you talking about? Get in alignment? No, I have so much to do today. Forget this alignment stuff. I have a list that I have all these things I must do. So for the person who is in that space, what would you say how we can find that voice that might not, for me, my voice is pretty accessible. I can usually, find that voice within a matter of moments. Sometimes it takes a couple hours if it's really challenging, but I'm well practiced at it. I had to break free of all of those yokes and chains. Not that they're not still creeping back at times. I think it's a work that we have to realize is a work in progress. But for someone who's starting at the beginning, where what we're talking about might sound like gobbledygook, what would you say?
Well, I mean, that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. And so I do work, that's part of why I transitioned out of the clinical setting because I really wanted to hone in on this piece of the work I was doing. And to go back to your first, the example that you brought up at the beginning of this show, of the woman who you're reminding me of a patient I had years ago who was this powerhouse of a woman, PhD, had programs and was giving lectures and doing everything literally all over the world. And yet, when she came home to her husband, she couldn't speak. She couldn't speak her mind.
Hmm.
And so we have all lived in this, and whether her husband intended it or not, like whether, like the example you gave, oh, my parents were very, strict or critical, and now my husband, even the slightest look from him, whether he intends it or not, I interpret it as, again, what I'm calling that patriarchal authority. And in the face of that patriarchal authority, I have no confidence to speak. Well, okay, so now we're in it. What is happening in the body when you're standing on a stage and delivering your message and your work to hundreds of people versus when you're home alone with this man who presumably loves you and all of a sudden you feel silenced? Where is that happening in the body? So depending on who I'm working with, yesterday I was just working with a young woman who says, she's fine one on one, but when she gets into groups, her voice gets swallowed up. And so, and I'm like, well, what is that like for you? Because I've never felt that. That's just has never been a thing for me, right? But it is the thing for the patients I work with or the clients I work with. And so she and I were chatting about what that is. And she said, well, I get into a group space and I want to say something, but my voice isn't loud enough to be heard. And I see all these people who are being heard, talking over each other, interrupting each other, interjecting, and they're heard. Even when I try to interject, I can't be heard. And I said, well, how loudly are you interjecting and how persistently are you following through when you try to interject? Or do you say a word or two and then decide that's impolite and then stop yourself and pull back? And she said a couple things. She said, first of all, you're right. I perceive loud voices as being angry, and I perceive quiet voices as being calm and, kinder. And she said, are you telling me that I can actually make my voice louder than it is? And I said, yeah, that's what I do for a living. But like there are techniques. So for me, like I said earlier, the idea of repairing a voice strictly from a physiologic perspective so that we're doing like a physical therapy for the voice. Many voice trained speech pathologists, that's their love, that's their obsession, that's what they do. For me, it's always been this multi-layered thing of how does the actual manifest voice, how does the physiology, how does the breath, how does that all intertwine with the body, the confidence, the psyche, the history, what your parents told you when you were little, why in the face of your husband you can't speak, but that then you can get on a stage and say whatever you want. It just is sort of limitless in terms of the different circumstances we can be in and feel completely empowered and embodied, and then our voice comes through that versus I don't know why, but I'm either silenced or silencing myself.
So, what I'm hearing you say, and we again are using the listener's question of the day to work from, if this individual who wrote in, who's sounds like she's anxious at work, anxious in relationships, afraid that speaking her truth will make her unloved, or in the case of her marriage, possibly end the marriage. And she's getting already that it's rooted in this childhood, this critical mom and dad scenario. So, what would be ideal for this individual might be to work on practicing that alignment technique in private to become in touch with what her voice does want to say. What part of her is feeling strangled? What part of her is feeling shut down? Practice that by just mindful moments, imagining perhaps what she might be wanting to say. And then we could take it to step two, using your woman who wanted to be louder in the group and actually amplify her voice so she could be heard. That was an epiphany for her. So we can see the woman in our question of the day that then she might practice with a friend or in the mirror, or maybe not quite yet with her husband because he's a focal point, but practice saying with someone that she trusts, this is my truth. This is what I want to say. And she might have to practice finding the actual physical voice as well as the words that allow her, because this takes practice. Neurobiologically, she will be rewiring decades of patterns to help her find that authentic voice. And what I've found, I don't know if you find this, sometimes as we're finding our true voice, we go from being very quiet and shut down to going 180 the opposite, getting really loud, even bombastic at times, super fiery. And then that's part of the practice. And then we come to the middle and we're like, oh, okay, this is that sweet spot. And that sweet spot might be different for different situations.
100%. 100%. And to know that you have a palette of choices rather than one default,
Mm.
right? So we've been talking since we were a year old. So a lot of these things have become very habituated, and they've become habituated based on our circumstances, our ancestry, our, what birth order we were, how many boys and girls there were in a family. I mean, I've heard so many times, oh, I was raised in this, big Irish Catholic family, and if you didn't scream, nobody was going to hear you. Um, and so again, if we go back to Jung's work of this notion of introversion and extroversion, I can see in a lot of the clients I work with who are true kind of authentic introverts. And again, from a Jungian perspective, what Jung meant by that is that the psychic energy was moving inward rather than outward. So we tend to think of introverts as, kind of in a pop psychology way as, oh, we've read the books on what it means popularly. But what Jung really meant by the introversion and extroversion was, where's the psychic energy moving? And that is more what I'm interested in, because again, with this client I was working with yesterday, just sitting with her, you could feel her energy was introverted. And so even just sitting with her, I could say, okay, I'm going to introvert my energy. I'm going to introvert my energy, but I'm not going to be any quieter. Okay, now I'm going to extrovert my energy and I'm not going to get any louder. And this idea that, yes, I have my kind of middle set point of what is naturally me on when I'm talking to somebody on a podcast, when I'm more in presenter style or teaching style. And then I have, like you said, I talk differently when I'm with my loved ones, when I'm with my parents, when I'm with my elders, when I'm with children. We have all of these, we code switch, right? Between. But then there's this question of sort of where's your middle ground set point? And if you're aware of having an introverted energy, meaning your sense of self goes inward, then it's a question of playing with how can I get into that alignment and then bring my energy outward when I want to. Not because I feel that I have to all the time, not because somebody else wants me to, but when I choose to. And that has a lot to do with getting into that internal sense of self, knowing thyself. I mean, it is, like you said, it's a practice and a process if it's not coming naturally for a particular individual. And like you said, if somebody is naturally very introverted, and they want to speak up, they will probably just start screaming. And so when I'm working with somebody, the question is, where's the nuance? Where's your spectrum? Where's the whole palette? And how do you learn to choose the color you want to paint with at a given moment in time?
Beautifully put. And as you're speaking, I see images a lot, and I'm getting this image of the masculine or the patriarchy, as we were talking earlier. I know, listeners, these are big generalizations here, so just follow us with it so you get the flow. But if we look at the patriarchy as being rigid, right, wrong, good, bad, press, go forward. This is the way to do it. And we look at the feminine or mother energy or nurture energy as being fluid and responsive, which is what parenting and mothering the self is all about, being responsive, being attuned. And so if I'm hearing you right, Soha, this is all a piece of going into alignment with the self is flow. it is this back and forth of what do I need now? What does my voice say now? Who am I now? We are still the same person, but we may show up in situations. We work on never losing that self. But that expression, depending upon if the person across from us is attuned and safe, we may be expressing in one way. If we're in a big group where we're not being heard, we may need to amplify and tune into that part. If we're coming home and a husband is being, or a partner is being loud, and as you said earlier, loud might be, it might be negatively, energetically very destructive, but it could also just be that person using their
Okay.
loud voice.
Yeah,
And
it could be
so
joy, it could be excitement, it could be passion. You just don't know.
yes. So tuning into and being okay, learning and going with the flow, that is part of finding the self and the authentic self, is realizing that we aren't static creatures. We're made 75% of water. We are meant to be flowing creatures, including being generous with ourselves as we find our voice, as we embrace that voice or voices, and as we learn to express that voice, because we can have a very strong voice, a very fierce voice. I have to hop back to something you've said earlier about if somebody, you don't have kiddos, but if somebody, were to harm a child that you were entrusted with, you
Mhm.
would, you would get strong and protective. I do think that that's part of feminine energy. That if somebody messes, have lots of feminine energy. I've worked to embrace a lot of masculine or power energy. But if somebody were to mess with a kiddo who's in my care, or an elder who's in my care, or a, an animal who's in my care, you're not going to get far,
That's right.
because that is my responsibility. And so I think that we want to remember, listeners, that feminine energy, whether you're a man or a woman, it's good to be fierce when it's appropriate. It's good to be assertive when it's appropriate. And we don't need to be in that space all the time. We can be wonderfully sweet and gracious and graceful, regardless of our gender. And when it's appropriate, if we need to step up. And so we are seeing, listeners, how Soha is guiding us into this beauty of finding your voice. And I want to take it one more place, Soha, to our listener's question. Let's imagine that now someone is in this relationship. They're finding, we're going straight to the home relationship, and they're finding that they're ready to speak truth to the partner. They're ready to say, I'm feeling like you're going to abandon me if I get it wrong. I'm feeling like divorce is on the horizon if I do too much, be too much, speak my truth. How might this person get to this space in a relationship? Again, we're just saying in this case, it's a marriage. It could be any relationship. It could be parent child, it could be work, it could be friendship. How can someone, we're now at stage 3. They practiced, they aligned, then they practiced with others and with themselves, and now they're going to take it and they're going to give it a go so that they can build on this foundation. How might this person build on this foundation of authentic voice once they find it, once they have the words, the logos for it? Now, what might they do? Step 3.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously, it would depend on, as you know, if you're working with any sort of client, it depends on the actual circumstances. But the most important thing I think in finding a voice is this sense of safety of knowing that you're safe. And so, if the assumption is that this woman is indeed in a marriage that's actually safe, that her husband's just clueless or not aware, right? That he's not a narcissist, he's not abusive, he's not right, because there are all sorts of factors. I'm not going to tell a woman who's in a relationship with a husband who's abusive to go like stand her ground. There's a lot more, there's a lot more to it. But if we're assuming a partnership where they're just in a habit, they're just in a long-standing She gets triggered easily because he reminds her of an authoritative father, but he's not actually meaning to be that way, and he's really receptive. Then it's a question of disclosing, and from that vantage point, it's a question of disclosing. What I mean by that is communicating to the person. We often in the speech pathology world tell people who stutter, just disclose when you first meet somebody that you stutter, because you're naming the thing. Then people won't be all uncomfortable about what's happening. Okay, oh great, okay, got it. Understood. Now I can be conscious and empathic and compassionate about that. Thank you for letting me know. So disclosure is such a powerful tool for communication, because with this woman, I would say to her, okay, you're going to go to your husband and you're going to say, I'm practicing this thing. Let's say, for example, I've been working with my therapist, I've been working with my voice, I've been working with whatever. I have these tools, I need to practice them. Are you game? When I feel like you aren't listening, or you're overshadowing me, or you are being authoritative, I'm just going to very gently put a hand on your arm. And when I put a hand on your arm, I'd like that to be the thing that gets your attention. So you stop and listen, so that I can take my time and space to say what I need to say. When I'm finished talking, I will remove my hand from your arm, and then you can talk again. And we're just going to practice this. There might be other things too, like I'm going to wave my arm. Whatever it is that's acceptable within that pair, to just start to get this idea of this is a flow. And, to your point of the idea of water being the feminine, water can't do much if it has no container. So this balance of the masculine and the feminine is sort of, yes, I have this flow and this fluidity, but if I have no structure, if I have no language, if I have no breath, if I have no body through which the voice comes, I've got nothing. So the masculine and the feminine are always supporting each other. They are always partnered. So if we think of the structure of the body as, let's say, many people think of the body as the feminine, right? But the body as structure is masculine. There's always this duality, always the yin and yang happening simultaneously. And if you're familiar with the yin yang symbol, in yang there's yin, and in yin there's yang. It's always both. We can't separate them. And part of the challenge of speaking in words is that it's divisive. In order to speak in words, we have to talk about one thing at a time. But what I'm suggesting is that the masculine and feminine are always in a dance. There's no getting around that. My vocal folds might be fluid, but the larynx that encases them, the voice box, is solid. And that solidity, that holding case, that home sort of structure is the masculine. So I can think of the structure of my home as being the masculine, but the home, or my house, let's say, but the home is the feminine, right? So there's always this yin and yang, there's always this fluidity. And so within that couple, they would just have to figure out, where is our imbalance? And what can we start to do to get that back in balance? And by putting a hand on his arm, that putting the hand on the arm, you can think of as the masculine, because it's a strong, like firm, I'm putting a hand on your arm, no matter how gently she does it. His receptivity to that is him now being in the feminine. And it's a constant dance. It's a constant dance.
Soha, thank you so much. I want to highlight, I know we don't have much time left, but listeners, I want to highlight the piece that Soha just offered us, that this image that the hand on the other person's arm is masculine, that holding, that pressure, but that the receptivity of the husband, being receptive, which is so critical for the health of any relationship, that the other person is receptive. So whether you're, same-sex marriage, whether it's man, woman, whatever, you need both people to be willing, and this is the dance, to be receptive to the other person. And going back to what Soha said earlier, we're assuming that this relationship is safe and generally healthy, and that the husband in this situation is willing to work, to learn, to grow with the wife, to evolve imperfectly alongside her. Yet if you're in a relationship where there is, as Soha said, somebody who's narcissistic, I don't use that term lightly. We're talking about narcissistic personality disorder. We're not diagnosing anyone. And we're also talking about abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual abuse. Those type of people tend to be extremely rigid and can be very dangerous and destructive. So we're not advocating these gentle strategies in those situations. Those situations would need professional support. Sometimes a lot of distance before the other person can be taught the skill of receptivity and listening and self-evolution. So I will have some links in the show notes, but I really love this image of the other person. We must have the other person being receptive. And I talk about this a lot so high in my fourth book, The Joy of Imperfect Love, that in order for any relationship to evolve, there, whether it's the relationship with the self or a marriage or a friendship or a family relationship, there must be the willingness for, if it's self work, the willingness for the self to evolve. It's work with one person or, a group of people. All involved must be willing, must be receptive. And that is that beautiful feminine energy or nurture energy or mother energy that we're talking about, that if we're not receptive, then the voice shuts down. The voice is shut down. So, oh my goodness, Soha, you have brought such an exquisite energy with you today. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other pieces that you'd like to share before we start winding up?
I think I know we talked about a lot. I think that one of the most important things for people to realize is that the voice, I believe, yes, there is an essence, a core essence to it that's tied to heart and to soul and to body. And that voice has many, many, many shades of color and possibility, and it's changeable. It's not set in stone. I think just like sometimes people think the personality is set to that's just who I am, but then they go to therapy and they say, "Oh my goodness, I can change my behaviors, I can change my thought patterns." The voice is you can change it. You can change it to be more in alignment with who you are. And looking at that can be really significantly life changing.
Thank you for that piece. And it makes me think that so often we're thinking when we're finding our voice, changing our voice, that that always means amplifying it.
Right.
Sometimes it also means bringing it down, not just quieter, but sometimes being more thoughtful with it, sometimes being more intentional, and sometimes being silent where we'd normally have thought we had to have something to say. So thank you, thank you. Where, Soha, can our listeners find you and your book?
Yeah, so my book, it's Even My Voice is Silence. I did end up self-publishing it through CreateSpace, which is part of Amazon. So I know that Amazon, it's like I can't say anything without some part of it being problematic. Amazon, I know, is problematic for some people, but you can find my book there. If you prefer to order it from an independent bookstore, you can absolutely do that and support your independent bookstore. Um, And my social media is a little limited. I'm mostly on LinkedIn. That's where I do most of my social media. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And then my website is my name. So SohaAljurf.com, sohaaljurf.com. And there's contact information for me there. There's a quiz you can take to find out which archetypal voice is haunting your psyche so that you can begin to unravel those voices that are stopping you from hearing and finding your own voice.
How exciting. I didn't know that there was a quiz on your website. I am
Yeah.
going to take it. I want to find out more about
Yeah.
this, about this work that you do that is really exceptional work. Thank you, Soha. And listeners, this information will be in the show notes, but again, the spelling on Soha's name, Soha, her last name, Al-Jurf. So you will be able to find our most wonderful Soha. And listeners, first off, Soha, again, thank you for your time, for your energy, for all of your wisdom. And to our listeners, thank you for sharing your time and your energy with us today. And this is Imperfect Love. Do you wish that you could speak your truth and show up as your true self, being fearless and empowered? All too often, you might find that your inner voice was quashed or silenced, whether it's from your upbringing, your relationships, or society itself. If you've lost the courage or never had the courage or the ability to use your authentic voice because you learned that you had to be good, that you had to be quiet, that you had to be obedient in order to be loved and accepted, let me tell you that the opposite is true. Genuine love for yourself and for other people truly comes from the freedom of knowing and expressing your inner truth. And today we'll be delving into how you can find and access that inner voice, that unique self that will allow you to live free, live big, and live with joy. Today, we'll focus on this listener's real life question. I'm always anxious, especially with my husband. He's a good guy, but really critical, just like my mom and dad were. I'm always worried that our relationship will fall apart if I say or do the wrong thing. It's the same with work and friendships. Is there a cure for this? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Manly, and this is Imperfect Love. Please note, as this episode contains sensitive information, listener discretion is advised. If you need support, please see the special links in the show notes.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. Remember, you have the power to transform your life and love fearlessly, if imperfectly, and it's my privilege to help you along the way. You can find more life-changing content, including my books and other podcast episodes, at drcarlamanly.com. Feel free to submit your own confidential questions through my website. I'll do my very best to include your issue on a future episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Until we connect again, this is Dr. Carla Manly wishing you oceans of blessings and love. Please note, this podcast is psychoeducational in nature and is not intended to replace formal mental health support. Please contact your healthcare provider or emergency hotline if you need psychiatric care. And as always, please take good care of your amazing, wonderful self.